So we're going to be looking, as I say, for the next 6 weeks at the true individual. This particular week's been entitled The Challenge of Consciousness. So the mystery of this consciousness that we all have. What is it all about? I doubt I'm going to be able to answer that. It's quite an esoteric, metaphysical question, but it's kind of part of the territory that we're going to be looking at. So I'm going to be trying to explain, first of all, a kind of Buddhist perspective in a way on how we've come about, how we're here. And then we have a look at sort of what is or what can we do about our individuality. We are clearly all individuals. We're different bodies. We're physically different, physically separated. We have skin, which keeps the insides in and the outside out. But when we look at a level of consciousness, it's not quite so straightforward. Are we all so different and separate? Or is there something a bit more to it than that? So this is a kind of an overarching question in Buddhism in general, and in this particular series, which I'm not going to go into in huge depth or detail, but it is worth bearing in mind that although we're physically separate, and that's undeniable, at a level of consciousness, it's not quite so clear-cut. So how did we all get here with this consciousness, whatever it might be? So from a Darwinian perspective, we just evolved. Most of us, I'm sure, are familiar with Darwinian evolution. So from his perspective, there was a primordial void, there was some event which gave rise to a chemical, and that chemical could reproduce. From that chemical reproduction, organisms assembled. There were amoeba, first of all, and then over millions and millions of years. From that, we have all evolved. Every species that we see in the world has evolved to occupy a particular niche, and it's evolved through selection. So it has particular traits that make it suitable to live in the niche which it occupies. Or it doesn't have particular traits which give it an advantage, in which case it dies. And the main conditions that give rise to the selection through Darwin's eyes and through Darwin's theory would basically be simple things like climate, availability of food, absence of predation. If any of those factors changed, then any particular species' advantage may be gained or lost, and the species itself may be gained or lost. So quite straightforward, simple summary of what is a very, very, very complex theory we can see around us. We can see in any of David Attenborough's marvellous programs just how complex this is. But in essence, that's what's going on. Things are being selected as being fit, as it were, to exist in the niche that they occupy. And this process, we could say, and indeed is, quite brutal. Things can die away in mass numbers without anybody particularly worrying about it. It's very, very brutal. And we could say that it's undirected. It has no, in a way, end game. For example, sharks, I read, haven't really evolved for some millions of years. They're as good as they get for the niche that they occupy. The balance of them and their conditions have not changed. Therefore, they've had no need to evolve, and they haven't. They've been fairly stable. I imagine there's some other species that have been fairly stable for long periods of time. So we can see that evolution, from a Darwinian point of view, isn't really going anywhere that we can see. It just sort of unfolds. Now, we as humans are a species. We're at the end of the primate branch of the evolutionary tree. And we have evolved. And we have specifically managed to evolve our minds. Quite why or how isn't clear, at least to me. But we have evolved our minds in a way that hadn't happened before. And the way that our minds have evolved so specifically is that well, first of all, we evolved minds that allowed us to sort of buffer ourselves from the conditions that drive evolution. So we wear clothes that keep us warm so we can occupy colder climates. We can build shelters. We can build fires, which gives us heat. We didn't have to go into the forest to find whatever might be available in the forest. We learned to farm. So we learned to be able to cultivate food. So we've learned, by and large, to be able to buffer ourselves from the stronger forces of Darwinian evolution. Not all, there are cases where we do still evolve genetically and there are selections taking place, but by and large, we're not as subject to these forces as things in the wild. Our minds also became, and this was quite a huge leap, self-reflective. So a self-reflective mind is aware of itself. So we're aware of being aware. We're also aware of other things, and we can put ourselves in another person's position. We can put ourselves in another animal's position. So when we watch a lion chasing a zebra for dinner, we can put ourselves in the position of that zebra, and we have a natural response of empathy for the terror that it must be experiencing. At the same time, we know that if the lion didn't do that, then the lion would starve to death. Their cubs might starve to death. So we can see things in a way that no other animal, as far as we're aware, can. We can understand situations emotionally that are not directly impinging on us. And we can do that because of the nature of our mind, which has evolved. Another aspect of our sort of self-reflective mind is that we can learn from the past. We are aware of what has happened in the past. We can remember it, and we can learn from it. And we can learn from it specifically in ways which allows us to manipulate our future experience. We can learn from the past in order to beneficially change our future. As far as I'm aware, no other animal, no other species is anywhere near the complexity that we have achieved in our evolution by whatever means that it was done. So we are in the world quite unique with the mind that we have. Now, all of this, all of Darwinian evolution, fits perfectly within the basic Buddhist teaching of Praticca Samutpada, the teaching of conditionality, the teaching which says that all things arise in dependence upon conditions. So we can see with the complexity of evolution that understanding this is quite complicated, is quite deep. From the Buddhist perspective, not only would all of evolution fit quite neatly within it, but it would be much larger. The Buddhist interpretation and understanding would be much larger to encompass the arising of universes, of entire universes, through evolution, and down to why Monday mornings are far less interesting or exciting than Friday afternoons. So from the arising and falling of universes, right through evolution, right down to our individual moods, differing between a Monday morning and a Friday afternoon, all of that is encompassed within the Buddha's teaching of conditionality. All things arise in dependence upon conditions. When those conditions cease, that which arose also ceases. Now, it might be that whilst we have an intellectual kind of grasp or understanding of that and think, oh yes, I get that, it is a lifetime's work to kind of really begin to fully understand the implications of that teaching. However, even from where we are, I could understand that some people might consider that teaching as saying that in effect, all things are somehow therefore random. There's just random conditions, and then random things happen, and then those conditions change and random things turn into something else. Now, that's not entirely true. We know that's not true. We can see that in our experience. And the Buddha knew that that wasn't true. So the Buddha qualified this teaching, in a way, you could say qualified this teaching, with another kind of observation, which we call the 5 niyamas, so the 5 orders of conditioned existence, the 5 orders of the world that we experience. So I'm not going to go into all of them, but the main take-home message from this is that in each level, whilst there's kind of changing conditions, there are also laws. So there are things that are predictable. So in a way, the teaching of Pratityasamutpada has to be seen as a middle way. Buddhism is always fond of finding middle ways. So it's a middle way between complete randomness and total predetermination. So our lives are not predetermined. The world is not predetermined. We have agency and influence. So Pratityasamutpada, together with the 5 niyamas, in a way, allows us to understand the middle way between those 2 extremes. So we can see at one of the, as it were, bottom, there's not really a top or a bottom, they're all interconnected, but for the sake of argument, we could begin at the sort of the level of inorganic. So if we have a rock in our hands and we let it go, that rock will fall downwards. It's subject to the law of gravity. The law of gravity does not change based on changing conditions. We can rely on the fact that if we drop a rock, it will fall downwards. The sun comes out, it's not going to make it fall upwards. So there are certain things that we can rely on in each of these niyamas. So as we move into more sort of slightly complicated things, there are laws governing biological functions, photosynthesis, laws governing thermodynamics, laws of physics. There are laws that are slightly more complicated, governing things like instinct. It's a very complicated area, but it just happens. And then we get to what we would consider as the level in which we operate. So we are alive and operating in the karma niyama. And in the karma niyama, there is also a law in operation, a law upon which we can rely, and a law that we can see in operation again and again and again. And that law is the law of karma. And that law states very simply that I'll just read this, make sure I get it right, that the consequences of any action of body, speech, or mind, so anyway, any way that we can interact with the world through our body, speech, and mind, the consequence of any action is related to the intention behind the action. So it's related to the intention behind the action. So if we accidentally bump into somebody, that's got very, very mild karmic consequences because we had no intention of doing it. It was just an accident. But if we intentionally go up and shove someone, then that has much stronger karmic consequences because that is an act of violence against somebody else who didn't ask for it. So we can see that even the same action can have different karmic consequences depending on the intention. It's the intention that is key for us to navigate and operate with the law of karma and the karma niyama, which is the kind of the human realm in a way. So given all that, we can see that we are relatively, not entirely, but relatively secure from the undirected basic, and another way of putting it, or Darwinian forces of evolution. We are relatively free from those full forces, which does give us the opportunity to embark upon what we might call directed evolution. So these two forms of evolution are sometimes known as the lower or the higher. Quite sure that I'm not so keen on the lower or the higher, it's a bit judgmental. I prefer that one form of evolution, as it were, the form of evolution that brought us to where we are, is somewhat undirected. And the form of evolution that we are embarking on now, on the spiritual path, is somewhat directed. We have an idea of where we want this to go. The other way that it's been described, which I'm very fond of, which I'll just say now, is that we can see our evolution, the kind of directed evolution, the evolution along the spiritual path, as being an evolution which is drawn upwards rather than pushed from below. So it is an evolution that is drawn upwards rather than pushed up from below. I quite like that distinction. And we are at the cusp of the two. We're at the pinnacle of one, and we're at the base of the other. The pinnacle of the other will be represented, of course, by the Buddha on the shrine in front of us. So we're on that cusp. We can make a choice. We don't have to do this. Nobody's making us do this. There are no forces forcing us to do this. This is our choice. So it's a choice to move from being the pinnacle, or as it were, the pushing up evolution, to joining the drawing up evolution. So I'm now going to go on and talk about something else, the next kind of stage of this. But I wonder if it would be worth just having 10 minutes, if we just get into groups of anything between 2 and 4, whatever kind of naturally fits, just to see if there's anything that's come out of that, if you kind of get that, if you sort of understand it, if you have a sense of being drawn rather than being pushed. So anyway, let's move on. There may be time at the end if there are any other questions that arise. But I'd like to just turn our attention now, sort of having brought us to kind of where we are in terms of an evolutionary perspective, to what the subject of the next 6 weeks is going to be, that of the true individual. What is a true individual? Well, that would take us into the realms of basically outlining the qualities of a Buddha. You know, we have the Buddha here. The Buddha would be our exemplar of a true individual. And many of those qualities will be brought out over the next 6 weeks. I'm just going to look at a few, and I'm going to look at them more from the perspective of what can I do about it now, here, tomorrow morning, whatever, and what can you do about it here and now, rather than raise the tone to incredibly lofty levels. We mustn't forget lofty levels, but I like things to be a bit more tangible and achievable. So what I'm going to look at is basically sort of 2 qualities, one of which I'll unpack a bit further, the other of which is going to be unpacked in 2 weeks, I think, in another talk. So I'll leave that for my esteemed colleague who will be giving that talk. So there's basically 2 qualities that we would need in order to become a true individual. 2 very basic qualities. There are a lot of qualities, but these ones are very basic ones. So one is to be free from group conditioning. And the other one is to be aware and to be developing our awareness. So to be aware and developing awareness. So group conditioning is something that we'll be discussing in a couple of weeks, much more fully when somebody else gives a talk, 2 weeks, I think. In essence, it means that we need to be free to think, as it were, what we need to think without a group telling us that that's wrong, or without a group telling us something that we're not sure of, and thereby inhibiting us from our own free thinking. So we can see that there are very often group conditions. A family can be a group condition. So there can be opinions and views in a family that we kind of imbue and feel reticent about challenging, even if we don't necessarily agree. Political parties can be examples of group conditioning where, you know, the people in the party are supposed to, or would be expected to be more aligned with the ideals and the thoughts and opinions of the party than of their own, which can lead to problems. Workplaces can have kind of group cultures and sort of group think. So I'm sure we're all aware of different situations that we may have been in ourselves, or at least we can imagine, or we can see other people in, where we feel that the person is being somewhat stifled by the opinions of the group. So to become a true individual, we need to be free of group conditioning. And it's a great asset and aspiration of a Sangha is that we encourage people to become true individuals. A true Sangha encourages true individuality. It doesn't try to stifle it by having kind of groupthink. Although it is a very near enemy of a Sangha, we have to be very, very careful. We have to be constantly vigilant that a Sangha hasn't just drifted into being another example of a group. That's all I'm going to say on that. So as I say, it'll be unpacked fuller later. And the next thing is we need to be aware, and we need to be working on our awareness. I mean, everybody to some extent is aware, but we need to be working on our awareness to broaden it and deepen it and make it more subtle. And there are basically 4 dimensions that we can be working on to broaden and deepen our awareness. So those 4 dimensions are the dimension of self, of nature, of others, and then of reality. So if we just take them one by one, if we look at the first one I mentioned, self, well, basically that's becoming aware of our physical body. Now we do this very often at the start of each meditation. So we'll do, as Vyashtaka did earlier, we do what we call a body scan. It just allows us to take some time to become more aware of our physical being. Now, we've been in our physical being all day, but usually when we're doing a body scan, we notice things that we haven't noticed all day. So we're in this body, but our minds are always somewhere else, or often somewhere else. So it's important that we develop a basic awareness of this body that we inhabit, of whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable, where tension is, where tension isn't. It's the basic of awareness. And then we become aware of our emotions, how we are, how we're feeling, whether they're positive or negative. We become aware of our thoughts, of our ideas. We become aware of our conditioning. So these first three are things that we do virtually in every meditation. So, but in meditation, as it were, we're practicing how we should be all of the time, even when we're not meditating. But we should also be aware of our conditioning. We're all conditioned by different things. We're all subject to different conditions. So some of them, for example, could be our upbringing, our tendencies, our skills, and our strengths. So it's important that when we start to do these sorts of awareness analysis, it's not about looking for what's wrong. The tendency that we think that becoming more aware is becoming more aware of everything that's wrong. To some extent, that's true. But it's every bit as equally true that we become more aware of what's right. We become more aware of what our positive qualities are. So our skills, our strengths, our likes, our dislikes. We become aware of our own uniqueness. We are all completely unique. So the genes and the conditions and the nature and nurture and so on and so forth that we've experienced and has brought us here is utterly unique for each of us. So we become aware of our own uniqueness in the world. And we become honestly aware. So by that I mean that it's very easy to think that we're aware of ourselves, but actually we're aware of a story of ourselves. So I've told the story before of in a management or in some kind of HR management program, whatever it was, I can't hardly remember now, doing a thing called Myers-Briggs that was a personality type analysis, and we're supposed to make sure that everybody in teams got on with each other or whatever. And I did the Myers-Briggs, and I was an introvert. And I had spent years and years and years telling myself I was an extrovert because I thought extrovertism was more interesting than being an introvert. So that was quite a shock. So I wasn't Buddhist at the time, it was years ago. That was quite a shock to me. But I often think back on it as to how easy it is and how long we can go on doing nothing but telling ourselves a story about ourselves that isn't in fact true. So awareness of ourselves, of our physical being, does involve a very subtle and important level of honesty, to be honest about what's going on. And then we can, we're running out to be quicker. Then we come on to nature. So nature's all around us, the environment, physical surroundings. We've come from nature, and at some point in the hopefully distant future, we'll be going back to nature, whether we like it or not. We shouldn't cut ourselves off from nature. It's important that we are somehow connected to the world out there. I remember similarly, I had probably the same job actually when I was doing that management thing with the Myers-Briggs. I remember a time where I had quite a nice house. It was centrally heated. I would leave in work clothes. They didn't change much. I'd get in my car. If it was hot, it was air conditioned. If it was cold, it was heated. I'd drive to the workplace. It was a pharmaceutical company, it wasn't offices. But it was a building, it was air conditioned. So I'd be in there all day, I'd come out, go back in the car, back home, or off to a friend's, or off to a restaurant. And I would just do that day in, day out. And I'd be completely cocooned from nature. Totally cocooned. I would just go from one artificial environment to another. Eventually it drove me slightly mad. It was just, it was just not healthy to lose that connection with feeling the rain in your face, feeling different temperatures, feeling the wind. It's very important to just be connected. It's where we've come from, and eventually it's where we're going back to. We need to develop an awareness of others. We need to be aware and, again, honest with the nature of our relationships with others. They're very important for our well-being. They're very important for the establishment of a Sangha. Without relationships with others within the Sangha, it wouldn't exist. And we need to be aware within ourselves of how we can positively influence those relationships and interactions, and how we can change relationships for the better. And then the last one is an awareness of reality. So an awareness of the cycle of life. We've talked about, we've come from nature, we're going back to nature. There is just a cycle to life that we're part of, whether we like it or not. There's nothing we can do about it. And it reminded me when I was thinking of this. So often as we progress, many of you have already done this. So we come along to these classes and then we go on a retreat, might be for a weekend, then we might go on a week's retreat. And as we progress, we might even want to go off on a solitary retreat. So we go off somewhere, middle of nowhere generally, and we're just completely by ourselves. So that's when we start to fully experience ourselves as we are, warts and all. It might not be something all of you have done. I wouldn't rush to do it. But I went on a solitary retreat many years ago to a place in Spain. The weather was lovely. I was having a lovely time. I was very, very content. And I would sit outside in the sunshine and have cups of tea and just be fully content. So that week went very well. I think that was my first one, actually. And then several years later, I went back to that same place for 2 weeks. And I was there by myself for 2 weeks. The first week it was really cold and poured with rain and was misty. And I wasn't enjoying it quite so much. The second week, the sun came out. And I thought, oh, this is nice. This is better than week one. And I was sitting outside my hut. There was a little table and having a cup of tea, listening to, well, there's some birds, not very many, lots of insects. I was listening to lots of insect noise. And I was thinking, the thought passed my mind that, oh, this is better. This is just like it was when I was here last time. I would sit in the sunshine, I would listen to the insects, and I'd be quite content. And no sooner had I finished that thought than I immediately knew that was not true. There was nothing there that was the same as last time. All of those insects that I'd been listening to were now dead. They don't last very long. The dust on the ground would have been washed or blown away from my last retreat and replaced by dust on the ground. The leaves and the trees and the bushes would have fallen and had been replaced by other leaves on bushes. There was basically nothing there that was the same. I was not the same. I was not the same person. So that sort of thought, followed by an immediate kind of smack in the face, which is kind of what it felt like, is actually an awareness of reality. That was reality reminding me that that thought I'd had was not a true thought. That's not the case. Everything changes all the time. So although it seemed very similar to the last time I was there, it was not the same. So when we come to an awareness of reality, in a way we're getting to the idea that although you are an individual with an inside and an outside, consciousness maybe a little bit more nebulous, you're part of the universal. You are still part and parcel of the universal. You can't not be. You are part and parcel of that. And as part of the universal, you have to kind of get into the sense that the universal that you are part and parcel of is nothing but a constant unfolding. It's just a constant unfolding through time. So time could be one of the laws of niyamas, it only moves in one direction. And as we move through that direction, things just ebb and flow and unfold. So this is when it starts to get interesting. When we start with, an awareness of our toes and an awareness of our elbows and things that we haven't thought about all day. But then our awareness broadens and subtles and deepens, and we start to get into levels of the universal, of reality, and what reality is, and what we are within it. We're just a constant change and unfolding. So with these two things that I've kind of unpacked a little bit, so freedom from groupthink, which I haven't really touched upon, and then with levels of awareness getting subtler and deeper, there are kind of like two things arise. So what arises is creativity. It can be immensely creative. And again, creativity is the subject of the whole talk, which is coming in a few weeks' time. I'm not going to touch much on that. But also, it comes with a degree of responsibility. So responsibility is really quite a key thing in our progress and in our development. So as I mentioned earlier, we operate in the karma niyama. So we are subject to the law of karma. That our actions of our body, speech, and mind have consequences for our future experience. They have consequences for our future mental states. Through this unfolding, our actions within this have consequences for, as it were, what subsequently unfolds, what our future experience or mental states will be. And we have to kind of realize within that that only we ourselves are responsible for the mental states that we suffer. We can virtually never put the blame on anybody else. Other people do act horribly, but it's our responsibility how we respond. Can act horribly, they can act very beautifully as well. And we are responsible for our own individual growth. Through our practice and through our reflections, we are responsible for our individual growth. We can choose to do it. Once we've chosen to do it, we are responsible for making it happen. Nobody else can do it for us. And being responsible for our actions of body, speech, and mind in any situation, we need to try to make our actions as creative as possible. Because the more creative our actions are, the better the future situation for both ourselves and others. So, gosh, 30 seconds to spare. I'll draw a close there. So, I hope that's helped give you a flavour of what's to come over the next 6 weeks. So next week, I've got it written down, sorry, the next one. Next week, Samudra Ghosha, who's online this evening. Samudra Ghosha will be giving us a talk entitled Personal Invitation, all within the global headline, as it were, of how to become or what is a true individual.